Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast of Vision New England. I'm here with two friends, Pastor Kenneth Young, who is the pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And as we were just talking, a proud new homeowner. And he's also a director of Vision New England. And Pastor Chris Goeppner, who's from Riverbank Church in White River Junction, Vermont. Chris is also a director of Vision New England and a board member of Vision New England. So welcome, guys. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. And so we're talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin today, and that may seem like an odd choice for an evangelistic association, but part of our work is really wanting to understand the racial divides in our country, and Uncle Tom's Cabin makes a pretty valuable contribution to that, with the understanding that our history is always with us. And so we want to understand how that impacts our society today, but how it even impacts the church today. We believe we're called to be peacemakers and have an obligation then to try to bring peace to a racially divided church and a racially divided culture. We believe as disciples, we're called, like Jesus was, to disadvantage ourselves, to love and serve other people, right? Being sacrificial, to remove obstacles that are in the way of somebody leading the fullness of life that Jesus intends for them to lead on this earth. The shalom the Bible talks about in the Old Testament, or the do justice command in Micah 6:8. So no matter what we might think about today's race problems in our country, what the root causes are, what the solutions might be, it's clear we've got race problems in this country. There's a divide, and it's hurtful, and it's destructive, and it's preventing people from living that fullness of life, that shalom Jesus intends. So we want to step into that. We want to work towards shalom in the church and in our culture, but to do that constructively, we need to understand our context, the different perspectives, develop some level of consensus as to what the problems are, what solutions might be, that the church could act in unity in a constructive way. This will be hard, not just this conversation. We planned multiple episodes on this. It'll be hard, risky, painful. It'll require listening to people we may disagree with at times, and that seems to be an unusual experience in today's culture. But want to hear voices that we disagree with, be patient, forgiving, do it all in humility, with love, and start to put on some of our creative problem-solving skills and sacrifice. But when we do that, when we're disciples who are willing to sacrifice, or willing to disadvantage ourselves in humility and love to help other people, suddenly people are interested in what we have to say about Jesus. Before we do that, we're just another option out there. But when we disadvantage ourselves to serve others, people care about hearing about who this Jesus is. And so we want to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're going to start with that as our dialogue. It really does give us a deeper view, at least from my experience, it was a deeper view into slavery in the U.S. Uncle Tom's Cabin, for those who may not know the book well, was referred to as the first bestseller. There were no bestseller lists in the 1850s, but it's referred to as the first bestseller. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a devout Christian woman, an abolitionist. She and her husband housed runaway slaves who were headed to Canada. It was published in 1851 and 1852. It was serialized in newspapers where chunks of it were published each week. That's an old form of communication that it doesn't happen anymore, I don't think. Then after that, it was published as a book. It was wildly popular. It sold more than 300,000 copies. Within a year of its publication, there were 300 babies in Boston alone named for Ava, who's one of the characters in the story. The printing presses had to run 24 hours a day to keep up with demand. It was made into plays. It was made into movies. They were all successful. It had such a huge impact, not just on the country, but on the country through the abolition movement, that when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he said, "So you're the woman whose book started this great war," right? A tribute to the Civil War. And so he was joking with her, but there was a truth there, because it really did energize the abolition movement. Stowe talked about her reasons for writing the book. being partly the Fugitive Slave Act, which just incensed her that people were being restricted by law from helping runaway slaves and being required by law to help return them to the South. She had recently just lost her 18-month-old son and said, having experienced losing someone so close to me, I can sympathize with all the poor, powerless slaves at the unjust auctions where their families were being torn apart. She had a vision of a dying slave one Sunday in church, and that motivated her to write the book. The book itself is written as fiction, but as she talks about at the very end of the book in a postscript, it's all based on real events and stories that happened that were either conveyed to her by slaves who stayed with her or that she met in her research. And so when it was released, clearly wildly popular in the northern states, hugely unpopular in the southern states. They hated the book. And it really sparked a whole genre of what became known as anti-Tom novels, where they then tried to write novels that portrayed slavery in a positive light. Given that history, it seems ironic that there are people today who view Uncle Tom's Cabin as racist and use Uncle Tom as a pejorative, and we want to discuss all of that. Before we do, I just want to give you a spoiler alert. We are going to talk about the book. We are going to talk about how it ends. So if you're planning to read it and don't want to know that, you need to shut off now. Now we probably just lost everybody. but assuming where that didn't happen, but we want to let you know we are going to talk about the book and how it ends today in order to be able to have an informed dialogue about it. But let's start by just kind of recounting that story. And so within the book, there's really two main subplots. And so, Kenneth, would you maybe take us through the opening of the book and then Eliza and George's story and how that plays out?
Yes, thank you, Charles. So in the beginning of the book, you have this owner in Kentucky. A lot of times you kind of hear the slaves call it Kentuck. When listening to it, they bring out this kind of southern drawn accent, which I think is very interesting. So you have Arthur Shelby, who's this Kentuckian. He owns a farm, as most people did during this time. Kentucky is kind of seen as West for America at this point in time. He runs up large debts, and so he has to pay those debts off. Most of the time, if farmers don't know how to pay debts off, they would use slaves because slaves were owned. Their slaves would be on a ledger, and they had costs. There's a price to each slave's body. His wife was a very kind-hearted. That's the way Stowe portrays her in the book. I guess you would say like they're easy on their slaves, enslaved people that they owned. And they kind of made this decision not to sell one of their slaves. And then because they were in debt, they ended up talking to a character named Mr. Haley, who is this kind of harsh slave trader. The slaves that are in question, Uncle Tom, who's a older, not senior, but not like young adult age. You have Harry, who was also on the farm, was the son of Mrs. Shelby, the maid Eliza. And so when Shelby tells his wife about the agreement, she is upset that he made with Haley. She's upset because they had made an agreement that they wouldn't sell this young child who, in the beginning of the book, is kind of there to entertain. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but he's kind of the entertainer. He's pure. At least that's how I see it. Him being pure, and it sounds like she's very attracted to this young boy, and has a heart for him, and doesn't want to see anything happen. So Eliza overhears the conversation between Shelby and his wife, and she warns Uncle Tom and his wife, Aunt Chloe. She says she's gonna flee. This was kind of shocking, I think. It was like, no, they wouldn't do this. They said they wouldn't, but she says, no, I know what I heard. So we kind of hear this woman who's standing up for her own, not just for herself, but for a child. And it seems as if at this moment in time, she's doing what she thinks she has to do, not just to protect her, but it's much more about protecting her child. So Haley pursues her as she runs away. She evades being captured. She crosses the Ohio River. And many times when you read slave novels or even narratives, it's always talking about crossing the river. A lot of times they are talking about the Ohio. If you had the opportunity to go across the Ohio, it is not a small river to cross. And so this book is talking about is half frozen. She's able to cross it. And the Ohio River separates kind of this line between the North and the South. So Kentucky would still be considered being the South. Crossing over the Ohio would be considered being in the North, which means that enslaved people would be free. So Haley, of course, hires a slave hunter to get the people back, get Eliza and Harry back to Kentucky. Eliza and Harry make their way to the Quakers. Quakers are known to be peaceful people. They had settlements. Quakers were known to be located in the Ohio area at this time. They actually would set up institutions to help teach enslaved people, those who were crossing over that river, to be free. They help teach them, help make sure they're trained, and they set up a kind of a free zone so that people would know, like, if anybody tried to come, that's not the type of people they were going to protect them. So they joined into that kind of a settlement at this time. And her husband, George, had to leave them behind. Who reunites with his family, who goes all the way up to Canada. And we'll talk more about that kind of, we're crossing the river and we think this is freedom, but then, you have the Fugitive Slave Act, which says basically that you're able to go get your slave back no matter if they cross the Mason-Dixon line or cross the river. So the slave catcher attempts to capture them. George, who says, like, I'm not going to go back. If it means me dying, I'll die, but I'm not going to go back in being slave and shackled. So George, he shoots at the slave hunters. They retreat. Eliza convinces George and the Quakers to bring, I guess it's Looker, I think that's how they pronounce it, to the next settlement where he can be healed. They finally escape to Canada and then to France. And then in France, he kind of has this notion that he kind of says this, I wish I was not a shade lighter, but 2 shades darker, because these are my people, which is very interesting. I know we'll get into that. But then he goes to Liberia, which is kind of this place that America kind of works to settle enslaved people that are now free, and America's not their home, but Africa's really not their home either. So they're trying to figure it out. So it's just very interesting at the end where he goes to Canada, where a lot of African Americans who flee America went to Canada, and then to France, and then from France to Liberia.
Thanks, Ken. So that's kind of one leg of the story,
right?
And then Chris, there's this other leg that involves what happens to Uncle Tom after the sale, and so take us through that, if you would.
So Tom is obviously the central figure of the story, is taken from his family. And so he's taken down this boat, Mississippi. It's interesting, the conversation that he hears on the boat. And of course, you get a kind of a glimpse into the separation between the slaves and the owners, the whites that are on the top deck of the boat, and the slaves are kept at the bottom. And that was an interesting little dialogue that you could hear there. And then, of course, on the boat, there's this little girl. Her name is Ava. As you mentioned, that Boston even had a bunch of I think you said 300 girls named Ava after the book was released. So she's kind of a real important figure as she falls into the water. After he had befriended her, she falls into the water. He saves her. And through that, Tom, who is in a very harsh environment with Haley, who is a brutal slave owner, he actually is purchased by St. Clair, another slave owner who's grateful to buy him and has a little bit more of a conscience, a little bit more gracious, I guess you could say. And Tom travels with St. Clair to New Orleans with this family, which is an interesting dynamic there, because you have the St. Clair family. You have a husband who is probably a little, he has a care for the slaves. He sees them as people, whereas the wife, Marie, does not. Maria, she's wretched, actually. You and I talked about that, Charles. An interesting conversation, right? And so Tom goes to live with this family or serve this family in New Orleans. And what's interesting, he has a unique relationship with Ava. They're both believers. They're Christians. Tom is a solid believer. And that's kind of the running theme throughout the whole story, is Tom and his faith in Christ, which when he's in very difficult situations, that's what he clings to. That's what he's, we'll probably talk about this further, is he's a Christ-like figure throughout the whole story. And Ava is angelic, and they have a connection in their faith. And so through this, interesting, there's a cousin, Ophelia, from Vermont. She's kind of an interesting character, where she thinks slavery is horrible, but she's very prejudiced. And interesting how her cousin kind of brings another slave. It's crazy. This little girl, Topsy, into the story, who Ophelia begins to mentor and teach. And it kind of, you begin to see the shift of Ophelia. She's no longer, sees the slaves as less than, but she begins to see the humanity. So Tom, he lives with the St. Clairs for a couple of years. Ava gets sick and dies, which is also a whole unique part of the story. This little girl dies. Her death has a real profound effect on everybody. And through this, what you see is Tom in his connection to her. It was a very central part of the story. Now that's no longer there. She's gone. Well, through this, not shortly after that, St. Clair, the owner, the man, he gets killed. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy in here, right? He gets killed he's trying to break up a fight, and he gets stabbed and he dies without really setting up a good will. Even though Ava had asked him to release the slaves, to let them be free, he did not do that, and he dies tragically to leave Tom with others at the St. Clair home, where the St. Clair wife, Marie, she's again a despicable person in the story. She sells Tom on her way out of New Orleans. She sells Tom to a vicious, horrible, he would be considered the worst character in the story, a plantation owner named Legree. And so Tom is taken to this real rural part of Louisiana, surrounded by swamp, with a group of new slaves. And this is where spoiler alert really kind of comes into play, where Tom befriends some folks. He ends up, one of the really important things in the story is Tom resists the opportunity to kill this horrible Legree. And the tension there, I don't know about you guys, Kenneth, especially as we read this, I probably would have fallen in the side of I'm taking him out, whereas Tom was the Christ-like figure, and he did not kill, because I think he's they always say Uncle Tom, and he's not a complicated character. I think this shows how complicated he is. He's a deep spiritual man, and his obedience is to Christ above anything else, above his flesh or anything. But all that to say, when all's said and done, he protects some ladies who are sex slaves on the plantation. Tom ends up basically, because he wasn't being broken by Legree, he ends up being killed by Legree, a couple of his other other slaves. It's just a horrible story where Tom dies. I was a little disappointed in that because I thought somehow, some way, Tom would be free. In a way, he's free because he's in heaven, but he wasn't free. So, very, very fascinating story of this, Uncle Tom who ends up dying a tragic death.
Well, you guys just reminded me, as I missed it until you were just saying it, is going back to my high school English class, right? For Eliza, the river represents a step in freedom. For Tom, the river represents going deeper into slavery,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sure there's something else
Very,
something in there.
very
And I
true.
never noticed that. And so that's kind of the overview of the story. And it's just well written, and I thought engaging, and right, I think she does a good job telling the story. But how did you guys experience it? And whoever wants to go first can go fine. If whoever wants to go first is fine. If one of you want to think about it, what did you think of it? How did you experience it? What would you say?
I'd like to say something because Kenneth and I have talked through this, and I wanted to kind of, maybe the two of us could talk about this. When we called, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, I called you and I told you I didn't like the story. I was really bothered by it. I'm obviously aware of, the tragedy of, American slavery and the effects, but reading a story of you get kind of drawn into characters, and, it really bothered me. And I remember Kenneth, you laughed at me, and I appreciated that. And you kind of spurred me on to keep reading because I was about ready to just put it down. And so I would say Kenneth really kind of spurred me on and encouraged me to keep reading. I appreciated that because I was pretty close to putting it down early on, just from it's a really dark story in a way. And it was a hard read. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, there was. You're making me think of the fact that I don't think there's anything in the book that we didn't know happened in slavery.
Yeah.
But the book lets you experience it in a sense,
Yeah.
right? Or brings you closer to it. And just that opening scene of the negotiation between Shelby and the slave trader, that we're talking about dollars and cents and people and being privy now to the conversation. Knowing it happened was one thing, but suddenly you're kind of feeling it happen. And that there's something different about that. And I agree with you, Chris. It's dark and it made me angry at times.
Yeah, I will say it's probably the hardest part for me reading it was the lack of feeling amongst the white people. As you read throughout, it's just like a desensitization or just an acceptance of the injustice and it's just how desensitized our people were. Yeah. It was hard, very hard.
Kenneth, what do you think?
No, I think I agree with Chris. It was a hard read. I think for me, it was better for me to listen. Just because you're able, it's almost like a movie, almost like you're able to hear the inflection of voices. You hear voices change. You hear kind of the ups and the downs in listening to it. But it was heartbreaking to kind of know that like we're in 2020 and a lot of African Americans still feel the same way. And so I think the conversation we had yesterday was kind of like this sense of, if I can cross the river, then I will be free, right? So if I can leave the South, then I will be free. And I think that's very close to my narrative. Someone who's Southern and has deep Southern roots. It's like when we go to New England, then it's different there. Like you could be free. Like you can do things that you normally could not do in the South. And then you find out it's basically the same thing or even worse, because racism is just so pervasive, and some people don't see it and some people do see it, but it's like, well, this is the way it is. And then we do have Black people in certain spaces, but it's kind of this sense of uplift never happens for the entire race. And it's like, so where do you go, right? And I think to George's point is like, where do I actually go? Like, who are my people? And that sense of not knowing who you belong to, which I find here in New England is very like heartbreaking. especially when you speak to a lot of different people, it's like, oh, I'm Irish, and I can go all the way back to where we live in Ireland, or I'm Italian, and we have this space in Italy right now. I remember when my grandparents came over on the boat, and most African Americans don't have that story. So you have that piece, but then the piece of being sailing down the river, right? The sense of going south meant that it's the worst. No one wants to go down south. It's the worst place for people of color to be. So you kind of have that, and I agree it is dark, but I also see this sense of resiliency. And that I always see in Black people, just showing up every day is showing that we're resilient in every way. And it shows that, that the times when they had laughter, it's kind of that Black joy that other people may not see, that you're able to find a sliver of hope in something that happened throughout the day. And I would say the sense of being helpful. You see the communal piece, even though we're all enslaved. There's a moment, I believe in the book, when Uncle Tom was like, I'm helping putting cotton in your sack so that you won't get in trouble, and I'll take the beating, right? And so it's a sense of being in community, even though we're all down. We don't have a sense of agency. And so for me, I think that was the biggest piece, the sense of agency. You see that played out throughout the entire book. Even from the beginning, it's you can entertain, but you don't have agency. And I think we still see that today, especially when you hear people, tell other athletes, you just shut up and dribble. Don't talk about trying to own your own self. You don't talk about being free, because you're an entertainer and we just want to pay you to entertain. And so I mean, it was good from that sense. The bad side for me is kind of hearing, so you hear theology in two different ways that's happening, this sense of liberation that happens. And I know sometimes we like to talk about that in evangelical circles, but Uncle Tom, he had a liberative theology, right? Throughout the whole book, we kind of hear him even spouting off scriptures to others about how God is able to deliver us, how God is able to make us free from this. And on the other side is well, you need to obey your masters, right? This kind of oppressive theology, you need to get in line. God is saying this. Are you listening, Tom, to what the scripture is saying? George, don't you know what the scripture says about someone who's not obeying their master, not doing what's right, someone who's stealing, even though they're in a place where they have no choice? And so you kind of hear this kind of duality between God being a liberator and then someone who's using God's holy word to oppress and hold someone down.
Wow.
I can't remember who said it. I always say this. I can't remember who said it, but I always remember the good things people say. But somebody was just saying recently that, the people would twist scripture to your point about God endorses this kind of slavery.
Right.
And of course, it was a slavery that was very different than was in the Bible, but also said, but how did they miss the fact that you had to free your slaves? Right? The year of Jubilee says all the slaves go free. How did we, right? If we really were relying on scripture, how was that missed? And the answer is because we weren't really relying on scripture. We were using scripture, right?
Oh, that's good.
And your point on agency, I think, Kenneth, is a really good one, because one of the worst moments in the story was when you've got Tom, who's the most decent guy in the world, torn away from his family, sold south, and what just happens to wind up in a family who, as good as a slave owner could be, right? They're good. And he dies after having promised Tom his freedom, and Tom's just screwed. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no other way to say it. He's good, right? So he tries to go with, hey, I was promised my freedom and nobody cares. And you're just sold to now the worst slave owner you can go to. Where, of course, Chris, to your point, where he's killed. And so, and to me, that's one of the most heartbreaking things, is that the injustice just cries out in that part of the story.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, Tom and George. I almost feel like they're both heroes so you have Tom is like the Christ-like figure, the kind of very okay, I'm just gonna stay in my lane, and I'm going to just be focused on honoring God in everything I do. And then there's George, who actually was he was pursuing freedom, and he ends up being, he ends up getting free. But there's this Tom who dies, and then George, who is in Canada, he goes on, in France and Liberia. And there's a sense of like, you can be one of each. You can, and I'm even thinking of my own life, like in the times we live in, there's so much there. Like, I could just kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna stay in my lane, and I'm gonna focus on what I'm gonna focus on, and I'm gonna love Jesus, and that's right. Or like George, you know what? I'm gonna make the most of every opportunity, and I'm gonna pursue freedom. And I thought it's pretty powerful. I don't think that there's a wrong in either of those. Do you? I don't think there's a wrong in either of those. I think there's actually, they didn't go much into the depth of George's spirituality, a little bit. He was obviously not as like tied to his faith as Tom was, but there was something about George that appeals to me, about his pursuit of freedom, his pursuit. I think there's a beautiful contrast there. I thought that was an interesting kind of thing going on between those two characters.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But I also would say that I think this is like a Black narrative, right? We oftentimes kind of whitewash Martin Luther King to being like this great civil rights activist, right? This is what he did. But he was a Baptist preacher, and he preached the gospel, and he preached about love. And so we kind of see that being shown in the early 50s and 60s. But then after that, you kind of get like the Black Panther Party and the kind of movement that happens after that, and like Stokely Carmichael, who kind of, I don't want to say knocks King, but in the sense he does, and say like, you're way too passive. And so I don't know if with Tom and George, we have this kind of generational gap, which says like, I've seen what my older Tom, I've seen what you've gone through. I'm not going through that. And so even with Carmichael, I think you kind of see that, like, I've seen what you've gone through. I'm not going to do that. Like, I come from a different place. I'm not going to go through that. And so I'm going to fight for my freedom in every way. I'm going to fight for my freedom. I'm not going to wait for freedom to come and take me or loosen my shackles. I'm going to take a axe or a hammer, and I'm going to knock the chains off myself. And so I think for me, that's what we see. Even in today, when we look at all of the things that we're seeing, when we talk about protests, even, the Black Lives Matter movement and things of that nature, I think you're seeing a younger generation saying, like, I'm going to pursue freedom no matter what. And I don't care what you're trying to tell me, even when it comes down to God and the gospel. Some people they may understand it, but it's not as center to them. It's not central to their lives like some older people, older African Americans. They see the gospel as something that's freeing them versus actually having someone else to do that type of work for them. And so I think we see that even when Thurman, sorry to pull so many different theologians in, but even with Howard Thurman, he kind of talks about, I don't need this kind of movement to free me because I'm already free. And so with Tom, I think at times you see that, like, I don't need anyone to kind of free me, although freedom would be great, but I'm already free, and the gospel has already freed me. Now, for me personally, I kind of see a little bit of weakness in that. Like, I don't want to be enslaved and be like spiritually free and like want to play this role of always being the one that's passive. I think we see that in Tom, that he's kind of passive. He has this kind of theological view that this is not my home. And like whenever God is done with me down here, then I'm focused on heaven. I'm really focused on heaven. When we see kind of George is like, no, this is not my home. I'm gonna make sure this is not gonna be my home, no matter what. And I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here. I kind of tend to be in the middle ground. And I like George's ambition, while I really am attracted to how Tom is able to hold on, as we would say in the Black church, is able to hold on to God's unchanging hand in changing times.
Yeah, I thought both characters displayed immense courage.
Yeah.
But both different.
Yeah.
Right. And I was saying to Chris at one point when we were talking about it one day that George is the guy who's got the gun eventually.
Right.
Right. And so I can be a lot braver when I've got a gun, right? Me personally, right? Than when I've just got to lay myself out because I want to protect someone else.
Right.
Both courage, but both very different and I think hard. Where Tom came off to me, and I want to probe on one thing before we go on to talk a little about Tom again, is there was one scene in it that was just, I complained to my wife about it. I was so mad about it. And it's the scene where they're talking about selling the little boy. And they clearly don't want to sell him, but they're in a jam financially. And so they're making sacrifices they didn't want to make. But at the end of the day, the little boy is stuck, right? And so they decide they're going to sell him, and they're going to come back tomorrow. And the conversation they have is, what is the most humane way to take the child from his mother? And they're talking about, well, send her out on an errand and take the boy, right? Otherwise, they just make a big deal and they don't get over it. And it's just inhumane to do that. And that was shocking to me, that they're talking about the humane way to take a child from his mother.
Unreal.
And the other one that I thought was another one that shocked me, and Chris, it goes to the hypocrisy that you talked about, is now Eliza takes the child and runs, and Shelby, the owner, says is upset because if someone may think he tipped her off, and that's why she ran, and his honor couldn't sustain people thinking he would do something like that. And so I'm concerned about my honor while I'm talking about how we take a child from his mother, and seeing no cognitive dissonance in that. And we do the same thing, right? So I think we need to be a little bit careful about how we judge people, but because we do the same thing, we just don't know we do the same thing. And so do you guys have any reaction to those events?
I'd say that was part of the book that really bothered me. It goes back to that desensitization and how human beings were considered a commodity or a product to be sold or dealt. And it's hard to wrap my head around it, and yet it still happens in the world we live in now. Mm-hmm. And such an eye-opener. And here's what I'll say, from this book, it caused me to have some grace and compassion on friends, and I feel like I've always had that, but it caused me to say, wait, have you really understood? Because something Kenneth said earlier, that a lot of this carries over, a lot of this carries over generationally. I just read I'm going to read a portion of another book. Can I do that? Is that cool?
Yeah.
And Dr. John Perkins says this: 200 years of slavery, followed by 2 or 3 generations of economic exploitation, political oppression, racial discrimination, and educational deprivation, had created in Black people feelings of inferiority, instability, and total dependency. The implanting of such negative values in a people deprives them of any true sense of self-worth, or any real sense of self-identity. And the end result of negative values is negative behavior that is self-destructive in its effect. Dehumanizing values only and always produce destructive behavior. And I think that, the children, how the children were treated, and how the families were separated, and how women were exploited, and how it's funny to me, you're treated as inhuman unless you're a woman and you can be my side sex. It's mind blowing, and we wonder why we are where we are in the racial tension, and there's roots here, and what Perkins says here really settles with me, and it connects to some of those things that happened in the book.
And then the thing that on that I kept coming back to in the book every time they would be talking about the children of slave owners who had raped the slave, is then they sell their own children into slavery.
It's unreal.
I just couldn't get my head around that. I think I just had never stopped to think about it. Kenneth, you're smiling. What do you think?
Yeah, because I don't think that's the point, right? Like, we're still trying to figure out whether Black people are human, right? I think that's what we're seeing in this text, right? Are they human? If they're not human, then I can treat them like the animals. And they can breed if I need them to breed. If I need to sell them, I can sell them, right? And so, one historian kind of accounts how much women were worth. And at this point, you're talking about kind of a side piece. They call fancies. These like light, fair-skinned, attractive Black people are called fancies. And then part of it is I'm selling my own kids because I don't want my wife to continue to be upset with me by seeing someone else's child that I made. That's another, it's a whole nother story for another day. But it's a sense of they're not human enough for me to keep them around. So therefore I can get rid of them whenever I need to get rid of them. And so I think we continue to see that. No, it's not as vivid, but you do see this kind of, when I'm tired of paying you to play this sport or to entertain me in this type of music, I can cut you off at any time, right? And so I know a lot of people like to get down on like, oh, well, you have all these Black people that's making a lot of money in the industry, but you can't really name one Black person that's driving the industry, that owns a company that's able to publish and make money. If they get tired of you, they can tell you, like, I'm tired of hearing from you. And I think that's what you're seeing today when people are standing up and saying different things about racism and needing to end of racism. If they don't want you, they will cut you off. And so for every Black person who's speaking out against this, they're taking a risk in knowing that my financial or my livelihood, my finances could get cut off by me speaking out against things that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, I always would tell our kids growing up that it's amazing what man can do to other people when we decide they're not human.
Yep.
Right? We saw it in slavery, we saw it in the Holocaust, we saw it in Rwanda, right? Once we decide they're not human, we can do a whole lot of evil that's unspeakable almost. Let's talk about Uncle Tom's story for just a minute, because Uncle Tom has become a pejorative in our culture. And so as I read the book, I really struggled with that, because at the beginning, right, Uncle Tom is the most valuable, Kenneth, you were saying on the books, he was the most valuable asset on the books for the Shelbys. And that was the reason that the slave trader wanted him. And he finds out that he's going to be sold. And I think it was George and Eliza that were saying to him, run. And he was saying, well, if I do that, though, then other slaves are going to get sold south, and I don't want that to happen to them. So he sacrifices himself. Then when he's at Legree and he sacrifices himself, he jumps in the river to save Ava, who falls in and might drown. Then he sacrifices himself when Legree wants him to tell him where the two runaway women are, and he won't tell them. He won't tell him, and so Legree kills him. And so I looked at him, Chris, you mentioned the Jesus character. I looked at him as a type of Jesus, right? Where he knowingly sacrifices his life so that others might be free. And I know, Kenneth, you're going to push back on the free question, but that he said, but that's the way I read it. And I'm like, so to me, he's like the Jesus character, and maybe a little bit like the Martin Luther King character. But it's viewed as a pejorative today. And so I guess two things, and maybe Kenneth, we can start with you, is so react to what I just said, if you would, please. But then also, why is that term viewed pejoratively?
Well, I think to your point that you're right. Like, he cares so much for people that he was willing to kind of give up himself. But I think part of that is this kind of sense of community. Like, this is what community means for him, and that's how it's played out. Like, I got to think about what's going to happen to everybody else if I happen to leave. Like, is a slave driver going to drive you all harder because they've lost a valuable slave? And then even with the women, him protecting them, I don't know. You know, I think it's sometimes you have to think, like, is he looking at, I'm at the end of my life? Like, I've ran this race. I'm at the end of my journey. I can see the ending coming, and they may have more to live for. They may actually experience freedom. And so I'd rather allow them to experience freedom, even though I may not experience freedom. That could have been in his mind when he was doing that. And I mean, I think, you know, everybody's trying to experience freedom. What that looks like, I don't know. I think even Black people today are trying to experience freedom. And that's why you see kind of this diverse articulation of what freedom may be for every African-American in America today. The Uncle Tom piece, I think, comes from, of course, after this, there are shows that kind of depict African-Americans in a bad light. There are plays that kind of depict African-Americans in a bad light. Uncle Tom is kind of that person that hems and haws, and he's always the yes sir master. You know, even with Mammy's, Sambo, I mean, you know, we can continue to go down the road. And I think that's a part of the kind of pejorative statement that you're never going to say anything to your slave master. You're not going to stand up. And so Uncle Tom is kind of portrayed as someone who doesn't have a backbone and who's afraid to stand up not only for himself, but stand up for his family. And so he's Uncle Tom. He's going to do what's best to keep himself ingratiated with those who are holding the whole race back. So.
Yeah, I read about some cases where they would change, you know, where they put a play on, typically a minstrel show, and Uncle Tom doesn't die to protect the women.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, he gives them up, right? And he's kind of a sleazy character in it. Right. And that seemed to take on a bigger life than the book over time.
Right. You know? And you kind of see this, I mean, if you've seen Django Unchained, like Samuel Jackson is, you know, kind of a clear depiction of a quote unquote Uncle Tom. He's like, no, you know, Master's, you know, he's good to me. I was in the house. He took care of me. So let's make sure the slave people do what they need to do, because y'all gonna mess it up for me and everybody else. And so I think you do kind of see that. And I also think when you talk about Uncle Tom, it's also portrayed in the African American community, like who's gonna sell us out, who's not gonna be with us when we want to start this kind of revolution. Who's going to side on the side of the oppressor versus the side of the oppressed.
Yeah, and you get all those different kinds of characters throughout the book, right? That I've got into the big house, and that's better, and I want to maintain my position now, right? And you see the same thing in the Holocaust, right? And I'm not trying to make equivalent at all, but you see the person who's giving their food to the other people and starving because of it, and then you saw the people who are working for the Nazis trying to oppress other Jewish people, right? So you see the same kind of different kinds of characters dealing with the oppression different ways.
Right.
It's not monolithic then.
No, I said this earlier, and I think it's worth mentioning again. I believe Tom, and this, I think Kenneth kind of unpacked it, is a more complicated figure than what we have portray or understand of an Uncle Tom now. Way more complicated, not a yes sir, yes master, not a, that's what we have. That's what I thought going into it. And reading it, I'm like, this is a complicated guy. Like, this is, like, as much as we're like, oh, he was Cali Knight, like he like kind of stood up to the nasty, evil, you know, guy at the end, Legree. Like he did stand up to him. He stood up to these oppressors, but not in a way that we see in the 21st century you would stand up to somebody who's bullying you. He didn't let him rob his soul. He didn't let him get inside of them. And you saw a little bit towards the end that was happening, but the conflict there. But very complicated and deep character, I believe. And it's unfortunate that we lost a lot of the depth of Tom over time.
Yep.
But I want to say, and I don't mean to cut you off, Charles, but I'm not sure if we lost it, right? So I think this is the hand of the system that's being played. So the narrative can change if I have the power to change the narrative. I know you're not going to pick up this book that has 43 chapters in it. Oh, what was 43, 45 chapters. You're not going to read that. But what you will do is be entertained by people who are going to talk about the book. And they portray the book a certain type of way, which means that I'm able to portray and change the narrative of Uncle Tom and the Mammies and all those who are working in these plays. And plays are entertainment versus actually reading a book in which Charles is saying that when she talked to the president, said, you're the one that helped kind of light the fire to start the Civil War. So I think that's the thing, that whoever, mass media in particular, has the power to change the narrative about how Black people are viewed. And when you see this, you definitely see, when you talk about the plays and the minstrel shows, it's viewed as Black people are stupid, they're dumb, they have to kowtow, they're not strong, they're mentally unstable, they need someone to look out for them, they can't look out for themselves, they're not civilized enough to do things on their own, and that's very different than the book. And I think that's the key to what we're seeing today, is that we know Uncle Tom because of the plays and the minstrel shows versus actually someone talking about the narrative that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote.
Right. You know, one of my takeaways, and we've only got a couple more minutes, but one of my big takeaways I think I recognized as I was reading through Uncle Tom is that, and the reason I wanted to talk about it is it's still with us. Slavery is still with us. And so the analogy I've used a couple of times is we raised our kids how to handle money in our family. We taught them how to handle money. And I taught my kids how to handle money the way my parents taught me how to handle money. My parents were children of the Depression. And so my children are 3 generations away from the Depression, and they're still impacted by it. And I think slavery is more impactful, certainly from my family's perspective, than the Depression was. And why would I think that's not still with every African-American family who was impacted by slavery? And then you add Jim Crow onto it, and so it's not like it went away one day, whereas the Depression just went away after took a decade, but still went away. And so is that fair to say that those issues are still with us? Would you guys agree with that, or do you think I'm going down the wrong path?
Well, I would say yes, from the slavery standpoint. I mean, there's research now that's showing like most African Americans are suffering from post-traumatic slavery syndrome or post-traumatic stress syndrome. That the pressure and the pain that has been put on African Americans have been passed down from generation to generation. So this kind of stress, this high stress level, living in the wrong neighborhood. Even if you're in the suburbs, you could be the only Black person in the neighborhood. You may be the only Black person working at your job. And so that's stress. And so you kind of get that with hypertension, with high blood pressure, the things that you're eating because your family didn't have enough money to get the stuff that you need to have a good diet. Or they passed along the diet that they had because they didn't have money. So the education piece is behind that. So you do see that. You see that a lot. Even when people are dealing with microaggressions and things of that nature, that is stressful. Each and every day, a Black person is stressed out about just living. And so that's why I said when you wake up in the morning and put your feet on the floor, that's resilience. And so I think you can pass that along, just like you can pass it along the debt, like you inherit debt from your parents if they were not able to make funds, make good financial decisions, or even acquire finances. When you talk about sharecropping and things of that nature, you got to think after this Civil War, what did they do with the slaves? Lincoln died. There was no plan, and so we're gonna have a whole episode
or more on that topic.
Yeah, it goes downhill. So yeah, I think you're right on that.
And
I said all that to say I think you're right.
And what strikes me as we go into Reconstruction is because of our sin, right? Slavery is often called America's original sin. Because of just like all of our sin, you can't just undo the ramifications, right? And so now when we get to Reconstruction and we end slavery as it was practiced, there's no good solutions. Everything is impacted by the fact that this was birthed of sin, right? which to Christians, it's like, okay, well, that makes sense. I understand why that is, right? Good rarely comes out, my sin rarely resents in my children having a better life as a result of it, right? And it limits your options and creates that thing, Kenneth, that you were talking about where, look, I'm not really, I've been a slave here. I didn't come here of my own free will. I don't really fit here. I don't really fit in Africa though. Mm-hmm. And where do I fit? And nobody can just come along and say, okay, here's your solution. Mm-hmm. Right? We've broken something and it can't be undone now, but we're called to undo it as Christians. Chris, last word.
I think that after reading this, it kind of stirred up within me emotion and maybe a little bit of anger. Well, I felt like I had some eyebrow raising moments, and I feel like I understand a little bit better some of the why that's going on in our country. Something that has been, I think, really bothering me as a pastor is looking back over our more recent history in the evangelical churches, how it goes back to what you were just saying, Charles and Kenneth, that this happened and then it ended, right? And then there was nothing that really, there was no real system or structure to help. Okay, let's fix what's broken. And the church, the evangelical church, was seldom to be found through that. There's something in the book that I took a note on, and it says if there was a exchange, a conversation. It says if slavery were to become bad for the economy, someone said in the book, preachers would preach against it. Let me say that again. If slavery were to become bad for the economy, preachers would preach against it. That's so disturbing, isn't it? And I think we have to remember people, and not our money, and not what our possessions, and not the things that have empowered us, but we got to remember people, and that Jesus died for all people, that he loves all people. And woe is me if I don't preach against injustice.
I just did a study of the Old Testament prophets, and what came through is in almost maybe every Old Testament prophetic book, but at least most of them, God is judging Israel for how they treated other people.
Yeah,
that's part of the judgment that's coming on them. So I lied. Kenneth, last word. Anything we missed that you want us to hear?
No, I thank you for the opportunity to share. I appreciate this time. I've been able to grow more with Chris, and so I think this book was a catalyst for us actually making time to talk to each other. I would say, I would love to hear more about how she talks at the end about what do we do. Mm-hmm. At the end of the book, she kind of gives this call to action. At least that's what I hear, is a call to action from Christians. And she's not saying like just people in the South. She talks about New England. She talks about everybody, like, this is wrong. We need to do something about it. Yeah. And then she even talks about, surprising, for me it was surprising, 1851 or 52, or maybe she's writing a little bit before that, she's talking about reparations. And I thought that was I was shocked to know that she's even thinking about that as an abolitionist. She's like, how do we repair? How do we repay them for the work that they've done to build up our states, our cities, and our towns? And as Christians, this is something that we need to be talking about. Like, we need to have this conversation. And so I think, and I know this may be a stretch for a lot of people that may be viewing this, but how do you make that repair? Like, how do you repair that? And I know we say it in a kind of a Christian term, we would say, how do we reconcile this, right? How do we reconcile this? And I think this call to action, that it's not just a Southern issue, but it's an American issue, and that we have to come face to face with this issue if we ought to be the Christians that God has called us to be.
Great words to end on. Guys, thank you, not just for your time today, but for all of your support and time in general, and for taking the time to read the book to be able to have the discussion about it. And so I'd like to thank you guys for that. I'd also like to thank Bob Atherton, our producer, and our audience for joining us. And our hope is that the book Whether you read it, love for you to read it, because I think you'll get more out of reading it than hearing us discuss it. But in any event, hope it helped deepen our understanding of that experience that is still with us today and still impacts us today. It's not to say there's not issues today, but we've got that issue still with us. And our goal is really to bring understanding that we might be peacemakers, that we might answer that call to disadvantage ourselves to solve these kinds of problems, or at least to explore what needs solving. And that the church might have unity, and think about the evangelistic impact if the church solved our racial issues and could then talk to the world about it. People would want to know who Jesus was. And so we really hope this and other dialogues like it will be helpful. Our next podcast is October 8th at 10 a.m. And we'll have, I think, also a timely discussion. We're going to have a group called the Colossian Forum with us. And we're running into a time where churches are starting to divide over politics. We're hearing those kinds of stories, and or at least just having divisive conversations and struggling to have unity in a hyper-politicized, hyper-polarized environment. And the Colossian Forum helps churches talk about or work through the minefield of divisive issues that are out there with a framework that offers worship, lessons, and practice. And so we'll be talking more with them about that and how to try and bring and not create new divisiveness in the church, but how to be unified as we go through what's going to be a challenging election from all the indications. So guys, thanks again for being with us. God bless you both, and God bless your ministries. Thanks for all you do in New England. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.